Frances Wright, America's Forgotten Radical.
Episode 2, Writing Well Female, How Women Wrote in Wright's Time. I'm Trista Yeager.
And I'm Eleanor Rust.
We're two history freaks with PhDs. This is a podcast about Frances Wright, reformer, philosopher, writer, activist, abolitionist before it was cool, and feminist long before the word existed.
Today, we're digging into how Frances Wright rose to fame or notoriety through her writing. Her books, newspapers, and private letters articulated a passionate vision for bringing about a more fair and enlightened society in Americas and Europe.
Or at least that's how her supporters read her work. Her opponents called her writing seditious, dangerously radical, and unwomanly.
Because by writing and publishing about politics, society, race, and class, Frances Wright was raising her voice in a conversation that in her time and place was dominated by men. Even her biggest fans had some trouble wrapping their heads around a woman taking up space in that sphere. In this excerpt, revolutionary hero Marquis de Lafayette, Lafayette, writes to utilitarian thinker Jeremy Bentham. He's repeating Bentham's words about Wright and adding his own thoughts.
Marquis de Lafayette to Jeremy Bentham, 10th of November, 1828. Several packets have arrived since I last heard from the noble, kind-hearted friend of whom you have said that she had the sweetest and strongest mind that ever was lodged in a female body. The singular part suited, as you have lately observed, to her singular character may be misrepresented by people not well acquainted with the purity of her heart, the candor of her mind, the enthusiasm of her philanthropy, the disinterestedness of her views, and the vivacity of her hopes. Her talents, indeed, part of which evaporate in theories, of the certainty and utility of which she has not a doubt, might, I think, have been more efficaciously employed even to promote her own humane purposes. But to know, to respect, and to love her will ever be, in my sense, one and the same thing.
Wow. Oh, mon Dieu. Okay, so before we go any further, I'd love for us to spend a minute situating Fanny Wright in time and with the people that, you listeners probably already know about. So all her friends seem to have used her nickname Fanny, just as a little side note, rather than Frances. So if you want to feel like you're a friend of Frances Wright's, just call her Fanny. But you're going to hear a lot of both in the primary sources we're going to be talking about and in our banter.
So Fanny is born 1795. That makes her 2 decades younger than the American Republic. So she's born 2 decades after the beginning of the American Revolution. So the Marquis de Lafayette and other heroes of the Revolution are old enough to be fathers, uncles, or even grandfathers. That makes her also a generation younger than Mary Wollstonecraft, a pioneering British feminist writer. And Wollstonecraft's own daughter, Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, is a very close contemporary. Fanny Wright and Mary Shelley are born and die within just a year or two of each other. That also makes Fanny 16 years old when Jane Austen publishes her first novel.
And the names you might most associate with American abolitionism and feminism in the U.S., like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Susan B. Anthony, are all born 15 to 20 years after Wright. So if her thinking and writing don't really align with the way the next generation talks about things, that's why.
So let's talk about Fanny Wright's own writing life. What do we know about Fanny's education and early writing?
Fanny was raised in privilege and wealth in Scotland and England, so she received a genteel education in reading, writing, European languages, and feminine accomplishments. We'll hear more about what that entailed in just a minute. But her inspiration for taking on big ideas, and particularly her fascination with the young Republic of the United States, really comes from self-education, by reading widely as a young woman in Glasgow, where she had access to a pretty amazing library, apparently. When she tells her activist origin story, she stumbles upon a book written in Italian about the young nation of America, and she basically falls in love right then and there with its ideals of liberty and democracy.
So one of her first writings that we know about is a play titled Altorf, which she had performed and published in New York City during her first visit to the U.S. in 1818. And she seems to, at that time, be really reveling in a social circle of revolutionary heroes and their families.
Yeah, the play was set in the Swiss Republic, very glamorous thing. I don't know how many things were said in the Swiss Republic in the English language back then, but
I do think that like the Swiss Republican struggles were a bit fashionable for revolutionaries at the time.
got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Sort of
I mean, they hadn't had kings for a long time. I think they liked that.
Hashtag Swiss style. Okay. So, and then what happens on that trip? That trip is really faithful, not only because of Altdorf, but there's another big publication that comes out of that.
So that's her book, Views on Societies and Manners in America. It came out in England and America in 1821, I believe. And it's kind of a travelogue. It's a part of a wave of European writing on this new country. So I remember getting little quotations of Alexis de Tocqueville in my U.S. history textbook as a high school student. And then Frances Trollope, whose name is going to come up again.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think. Okay. Also writing about basically like what is this whole thing America about? Let's tell you. I mean, it almost seems like clickbaity to me sometimes.
Oh, especially the Trollope version, which, if you're really into like horrific stories about alligators, definitely check out her travelogue. And if you think Kentuckians are actually 7 feet tall, there you go.
Wow.
She's the writer for you.
Wow.
She's quite a character.
But one thing that really characterized Wright's views on society and manners in America is how in love she was with this young nation, rather than seeing it as savage and
alligator prone.
She really focuses on its civic accomplishments. But I also want to point out that its format, it's written in an epistolary format or in the form of letters. This is a pretty common genre for all kinds of writing in this period. There's novels in epistolary format. A lot of writing in periodicals is presented in the form of letters. And also want to shout out Mary Wollstonecraft's own travelogue writing. She wrote letters from Sweden and other Scandinavian countries. So it lends a conversational and intimate tone, but really it's almost like, blogging and vlogging gives you that feeling like you're experiencing it with her. Now, that book about her trip to America is really her claim to fame. It's controversial in Britain. Reviews of it really fall on a Tory Whig divide. That's roughly conservative progressive divide. She's seen as naive and dangerously prone to radicalism by the conservative reader, and then by the liberal reader who's more interested in revolution, reform, and democratic practices. They see her book as pretty positive.
So this all kind of begs the question, how special was Frances Wright? Was she one of just a few people, or was she one of many women who, for various reasons, wrote? And so, we've mentioned everyone from Jane Austen, Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley. That's not all that many people, all told, or Frances Trollope for that matter. But there were a lot of other women writing as well. But it all kind of makes you wonder, what did it mean to write while female in the 19th century? I want to bring in an expert here.
So we're going to hear from Etta Madden. Etta is a writer, teacher, and researcher with wide-ranging interests in literature, 19th century women writers, utopian and intentional communities, and religious history. She's an emerita professor at Missouri State University and a charter member of the Society for the Study of American Women Writers. She's written on women who made a living by editing and writing for periodicals in the 19th century, and on Shaker women's reading, writing, and preaching. Hey, Etta, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I'm really happy to be here. I look forward to our conversation.
Let's start with kind of a big picture. What did it take for a woman to become a professional writer in the first half of the 19th century? What challenges did women writers face that men didn't?
Well, so that's a really huge question. First of all, they had to be literate, which men also had to be. Education for women had kind of taken off at the end of the 18th century, and then continued to really mushroom with common schools and private schools for women in the 1820s, especially in the 1830s. So literacy obviously was a really big deal. They also had to have time and space for writing. They had to have the tools. A lot of people know Virginia Woolf's quote about having a room of one's own to be able to write. But in the 19th century, there were a lot of women that did not have their own rooms and they found ways to write, but they had to have pen and paper, obviously, which we may think is a common thing, but we're talking about privileges. Not everyone had literacy and had pen and paper. But I think more important at a kind of emotional level is they had to have a strong enough desire to put their ideas and their voices out there. And it seems that for men, that came more easily because they were accustomed in the culture, patriarchal culture, where men were in charge of things. Men didn't think twice probably about speaking up and about writing and sharing their ideas. So for women to become writers, it really took a lot of courage. So I really want to underscore courage as well as their education and having a belief that they had something to say. So I'd say that was the most important. And then, sort of as an offshoot from that courage, sometimes their courage was influenced by believing that what they were going to write would not come back to burn them. So they had to make decisions not only about what they wanted to write about, but how they were going to express it. I can give you some examples if you want those, or you may want to save those till later.
I'd love to hear about that. What kinds of writing could come back to burn a woman?
Well, so one of the women who was of the same era as Frances Wright, or Fanny Wright is probably the easiest way to refer to her. One of the women in the same era was Lydia Maria Child, a New England woman born in 1802. She wrote a novel published in 1824 called Hubbamock. Her name was not on the title page. That is a Native American name, the hero of the novel. And that novel was written by a lady. So it was written pseudonymously, or without a name actually, anonymously. There is an interracial relationship in that novel, an Anglo woman and a Native man. I will not give any spoilers for how it actually ends, but the fact that she's presenting that what would have been called an interracial marriage was quite radical. Her name was not on that cover. Now, it could have been because it was still considered not proper for women to write, but it also could have been that because she was pushing the edges of the envelope of the Native American question, that she didn't want her name on there for that reason as well. The same author, Child, about a decade later, publishes an essay. At this point, she's known as a famous author. It's come out that she's published these novels. She's editing a magazine for children. She writes an essay called An Appeal in Favor of that class of Americans called Africans, published in 1833. There is such a backlash against this abolitionist piece that her readership completely falls off.
Wow.
Now, she's writing because of what she believes in, but she's also writing with a little bit of financial imperative. She could definitely use the money. And so the fact that her audience fell off after she took a stance against slavery, I think is a great example of how the content that a woman was writing could come back to bite her.
So what was a safe topic?
A safe topic was to write about the marriage plot and to write about domesticity that would be focused on traditions of white women of privilege or of an aspiring middle class. And that would privilege marriage and women in the domestic realm and raising children as a way to maintain the civic fabric of 19th century US society. Now, there are a lot of variations on the marriage plot, but to focus on that.
And I'm betting it's not a coincidence that the women who wrote that kind of writing are the ones that remain the most famous. I'm thinking of, Jane Austen is the first to come to mind there.
Right. And there's been a lot of ink spilled about how much Jane Austen really was in line with her female characters and how much, there's a second story going on.
Of course.
And the same was true with one of Child's contemporaries and Fanny Wright's contemporaries, Catherine Maria Sedgwick, a little bit older than Wright and Child. She wrote a lot of novels, a lot of marriage plot. She did have some single women characters, but a lot of marriages presented happy marriages at the end. And she's pretty much forgotten, except for people who study women writers in the US, right? Probably the one that's better known is Harriet Beecher Stowe in the US. Uncle Tom's Cabin, published around 1850, first in a periodical and then published as a standalone book. even though Stowe was pushing against slavery, she very clearly kept women in the domestic realm. She really believed that the hand that rocked the cradle ruled the world. And she wrote that again and again in her novels, not those words, but women could do a lot through the way they managed their households and raised their children.
Interesting. You mentioned a periodical was the first place that Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared. Can you tell us about what was happening in periodical publishing at this time? Did periodicals offer women writers ways to make a living?
So I'll do the best I can on answering that question.
Okay.
And again, with kind of a bigger picture, one of the things that's happening, of course, in the middle of the 19th century is just an explosion of publishing because of the steam-driven printing press. And also, the copyright laws were not as strict earlier in the century as they were later in the century. And so that allowed the periodical press to generate a lot of materials for which editors needed fill, right? Like a lot of our online, zines and blogs. It's like, oh, this is going out every week. I need a lot of content. And so editors were looking for submissions, mostly, shorter pieces, a lot of poetry, a lot of essays, a lot of short kind of humor columns. And so there were women who were able to submit to those periodicals, often published without their names. And yes, there were small financial incentives for having those. Some women were paid for their editorial work as well. I know more about the US and very little about what was happening across the Atlantic in England. But one of the examples is Child herself that I already mentioned. So she has this novel that is really popular, Hobbamock in 1824, and she starts publishing the Juvenile Miscellany, which is a children's periodical, in 1826. One of the reasons those sell so well is that they're less expensive, which means more people can purchase them and read them. And so she's really successful with that and appealing to children. And of course, adults are reading what their children are reading. They're reading it to them, they're reading it with them. And she continues as an editor, but another one of her same era is Eliza Leslie, a Philadelphia woman who did not marry. She submits a story to Godey's Ladies Book, which is the premier 19th century publication for women in the US. She wins a story contest, which is another one of the ways periodicals were, getting women to submit things. They would have a contest with a prize. Leslie won a prize for her story, Mrs. Washington Potts, in 1832. After she wins that prize, she soon after submits more stories, and within a few years, she's asked to become an editor. And so she is able to make money from submitting her stories and from being an editor. So yes, the periodical press is popular.
Were women able to carve out careers? Were they able to support themselves and their families this way?
Yes and no, depending on how popular the work was. Harriet Beecher Stowe was able to make money from Uncle Tom's Cabin, and publishers wanted her to write more. It was really important to her because her husband wasn't making the kind of money that was needed to raise their super large family. Lydia Maria Child's husband was not able to be financially supportive the way that they needed to live. And so Child's publications also helped the two of them. And she became very prominent. Leslie also was able to at least support herself through what she made. Many of them, like Leslie, did have some other means of support. Maybe it was real estate the family owned, but Leslie did not have a husband, right? So for the single women, it was really important that they had some way to survive.
Interesting. So you mentioned that women's education was changing in the 1820s and 30s. Can you tell us more about that change?
Yeah, so I'll do what I can. Again, it's a big question, so I'll see what I can do.
We're covering a lot of century and a lot of big changes.
Yeah. So one of the ways to think about it is this is about the U.S. What were the goals of education? And in colonial America, in colonial New England, when there was a strong Protestant population, the emphasis on literacy in the 17th and early 18th century was really about being able to read the Bible, and children were schooled at home, both male and female. Much later, after the Revolution, when we do have common schools beginning and schools did have to put some taxes toward at least early education for girls, the emphasis then was on what do they need to learn to become good domestic managers. So if a young girl going to school, ending her schooling at about 12, which we would say now is about sixth grade age, that was the end of the common schooling, which it was, what did they need to know? And it was really just enough reading, writing, and arithmetic to be able to manage a household, because that was what they were expected to do. And again, we're talking about women of the middling class and above. And so that's the way that education was until there was a push for this development of more intellectual skills with some of the same things that young men were studying, like history and geography and literature, other languages. And so there were people who believed that that should be open to women as well. And so these private seminaries, they were called seminaries, even if they didn't have a religious imperative, they were referred to as seminaries. And so women began to be enrolled in those if their family could afford it. And the seminary boom really took off in the early 19th century, really mushrooming in the 1820s and 1830s. So maybe could you repeat the question of what else you would like to know about this educational movement in the 20s and the 30s?
No, that trajectory sounds really interesting. That over the course of Frances Wright's lifetime, we had basically a shift in what women's. I mean, it sounds like to some degree what women's role could be.
Right. And okay. And so that is another part here. So if women are learning these classical languages, other contemporary languages, if they're doing something other than learning needlework or music or fine arts, what are they going to do with this information they get from reading literature, from studying history? And so it raises the challenge then of where does that intellectual development go? What's its end goal, right? Especially if a woman is just going to be in the household. And what happens as a result is a lot of women really have this urge to share their ideas about civic development, civic virtue, and civic responsibility. In other words, what can we as women do to improve society if we're, instead of just raising children to be good moral citizens? What else can we do? And that's where I think we began to see this desire to speak, to write, literature that would be accessible, that would speak to other women. And I think that's where we really have an explosion of writers like Child and Sedgwick, Margaret Fuller, Eliza Leslie. So there is a belief that intellectual development that these women have should be then shared with the larger public to help change society or to uplift society. And that's why they take on these social causes like slavery or abolition, I should say, the social cause of abolition, temperance, Native American rights. And so we began to see that women taking on those causes in the 19th century.
Interesting. You mentioned women speaking, and we know that Frances Wright attained fame, even notoriety as a public speaker. I'm curious to know about other women who made careers or included speaking publicly in their careers. How did that go for them?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because these women who are writing novels, one of the phrases that's been used to describe them by scholar Mary Kelly is that they were on a private stage. They were writing in their homes rather than going out and speaking. So those women were much more careful. There have been women speaking publicly for a long time, right? And taking on roles in the theater, and they often were like pushed aside or considered as less than or immoral. A lot of my scholarship began with women who had spiritual fervor or religious inclinations. And so in revolutionary America and the colonies, British colonies, there were women who were driven by the spirit to speak publicly. One of those was the founder of the Shakers, Mother Ann Lee. She was deemed illiterate, but she went around preaching what the spirit directed her to preach. She was persecuted as a result. A lot of people say that her early death was probably a result of persecution that she received. She was accused of being a man in woman's clothing, because her behavior was beyond the bounds of what a woman was supposed to adhere to. There are Quaker women who were itinerant preachers and also were sort of abused verbally. This is primarily the 18th century. One example in the 19th century, though, is Black woman Rebecca Cox Jackson, who was associated with the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. She too was deemed illiterate as a young woman, was driven by the spirit to share her visions of what it meant to be spiritual, begins preaching as an itinerant, is basically driven out of the AME church because she is stepping beyond her bounds. She does not let that quiet her. She ends up traveling from Philadelphia north up to a Shaker village in Albany, New York, and joins with the Shakers, leaves the Shaker community in Albany, New York, goes back to Philadelphia and establishes what comes to be referred to as a community of Black Shakers. So that's an example of a woman who was driven to speak and was not worried about what would happen. I think in some ways it takes us back to that early question about what would drive a woman to write. And one of the final things that I said was courage, right? Courage, courage, courage. And I think that's true of the public speakers as well. Fanny Wright had courage that these women writers, the novelists, did not have.
Interesting. Interesting. So you've described one aspect of your scholarship as recovering these women writers. Why do you think their contributions were forgotten? We dug into a little bit of the writers who kind of follow the rules writing the marriage plot and the writers who find other topics. But I wondered if you had an impression of why these women writers' contributions were forgotten. And I wanted to know, why is that recovery project important to you?
So this I can say absolutely. I think I know reasons why they've been forgotten, and I'm not alone.
Yes.
There are other people that have written about this. One is that the canon formation, the decisions about what should be read and what should be taught in high schools, in colleges, universities, really started in the early 20th century. And that work was done by men. And they were promoting their peers who were writing about topics that they believed were important. And so domestic issues, they did not believe were important. So there's that. That's probably one of the easiest things. Now, since the 1980s, a lot of people like Mary Kelly and Nina Bain, who were really foremothers for opening up the canon and including women writers in it, they have also said those marriage plots are important. They are really important. A lot of the readers of novels are women. You know, there's a reason Nathaniel Hawthorne is known for his quote about the damned mob of scribbling women. All of these women writers that were writing about domestic life and marriage, they were threatening to the male writers. They were outselling them. So one of the reasons that these very popular 19th century authors have been forgotten is that many of them were writing in periodicals. Many of them were writing poetry and were writing short fiction. And again, when the canon formation came around, I think there was so much of a privilege toward longer fiction and toward novels that a lot of the women who were writing other types of works were just kind of set aside. Essay writing, for example, most people that are in literary studies don't want to read essays. They want to read Jane Austen. They want to read Harriet Beecher Stowe. They want to read novels or fiction. There's a privilege of fiction over essays, poetry. So that's
and yet essays were so important to readers at the time, right? I mean, essays made a huge portion of periodicals.
Yes, we divide genres today. We slice up genres and say we want to read this genre, we don't want to read that genre. But in the periodical publishing, people would pick up the newspaper or the periodical, and they would read whatever was in there that caught their eye, and they didn't necessarily distinguish between, oh, this is fiction, oh, this is nonfiction. They read because they wanted to read the voice of someone.
Interesting.
So why is recovery work important to me? Because throughout history, a lot of people have been overlooked who are a major portion of society. And if we're going to have any kind of understanding of the past, we need to try to be open to the voices that have not been heard. And I think the recovery of women writers and stories of women like Fanny Wright, who were speaking publicly, they are really important for us to know and to celebrate.
I wish we could share all of our conversation with Etta. She told us about more daring women writers of the 19th century from her research, including Margaret Fuller, an American woman connected with Ralph Waldo Emerson's circle, who had a really unconventional career and sadly a tragic early death. But that's for another podcast. Ooh.
I know, honestly, all the writers and speakers she mentioned kind of deserve their own podcasts. So listeners, definitely check out Etta's bibliography, and we'll share some links in the show notes. And if you're interested in this topic and want a super accessible intro, you have to check out Why She Wrote, A Graphic History of the Lives, Inspiration, and Influence Behind the Pens of Classic Women Writers by Lauren Burke and Hannah K. Chapman. Lauren and Hannah are also the hosts of Bonnet at Dawn, an incredible podcast about overlooked women writers of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and they are a huge inspiration for me.
All right, now back to Fanny Wright and her writing. I want to spend a moment talking about her book, A Few Days in Athens. It was probably begun in her teen years, but it wasn't published until 1822. This book was so important to her that she kept returning to it to revise it during her lifetime over and over, adding chapters, adding little sections. So I'd love to take a moment more to talk about it. It's kind of a weird book. I mean, it reads like a novel. There are characters, there's dialogue, but it's sort of a classical pastiche. It feels like it's this lost conversation revolving around the school of the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. Eleanor, I'm really sorry. I'm going to put you on the spot a bit here, but you have a very extensive education in classics, that is ancient Greek and Latin literature. So help me here. I want to hear your take. What do you make of books like this? Why would she write about this random Greek philosopher?
Okay, well, first of all, I am not an expert on Greek philosophy or on what we call reception studies. That's how classical texts were interpreted and deployed in later years. But I can give you a quick rundown. So first, some background, which is that classical education, that is learning Latin and ancient Greek, was really baked into the upper class British and American school systems for boys from their early years. So reading the great literature of ancient Greece and Rome became a marker of class and status that really stuck with those men throughout their lives and careers. Just for example, some of the most prestigious honors at Oxford and Cambridge were the prizes for Greek and Latin composition, like original compositions in Greek and Latin. And even if they never wrote another Greek poem, they knew references and tags. It became their in-jokes. It became their ways they recognized each other and kind of lorded it over less educated nouveau riche people. As Etta mentioned in the interview, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, it wasn't yet systematically taught to girls of any class. So they might learn Greek or Latin, probably Latin first, if they could pick it up from a father or brother who really believed in their intellectual potential. So for Fanny Wright to write in this classical vein was really staking a claim to be taken seriously in an elite world of education and serious public thinking. Now, it is this pastiche, but her introduction frames it as a translation of a lost work.
Yeah, that's really fun. It's sort of this ancient scroll that she has somehow translated.
Although she gets a little distance. She says she's actually translated it from Italian. And an Italian scholar translated it from Greek. Anyway, this is wild. But before we go any further, I do want to shout out a scholar who is an expert in classical reception studies, especially Victorian women writers, Isabel Hurst. Isabel is a lecturer in English at Goldsmiths University of London, and she wrote the book, actually, Victorian Women Writers and the Classics, The Feminine of Homer. We had a fantastic chat about this topic as a preparation for the podcast, but I just couldn't find time in this episode for a full-on interview. But definitely if this rabbit hole is appealing to you, you should totally check out her books and articles, which we will link in the show notes. All right, now back to A Few Days in Athens by Fanny Wright. The Epicurean atmosphere is important. So she's presenting this as a lost dialogue of the Greek philosopher Epicurus. Epicurean philosophy has some pretty significant associations for her first readers. Just loosely, and just in case you're not up on your Epicurean philosophy.
Right, doesn't it mean you really like food a lot? You're a foodie, right?
Yeah. Well, you know what? That is weirdly part of it. But loosely, like at its core, it focuses on cultivating a kind of serenity, a kind of a happiness that's understood as a freedom from pain and fear, especially the fear of death. But the basics of Epicurean ethics is that moral behavior promotes serenity in our one brief human life without any reference to gods or an afterlife. So the traditional church, the Church of England, I think also the Catholic Church, saw that philosophy as pretty anti-Christian, that it bases all moral decisions on it, measuring it against that the serenity of everybody around us, not about heaven, hell, or divine punishment. But those very things also make it popular with Enlightenment thinkers like Thomas Jefferson. It really aligns with the idea that people and nations could aspire to rational living. So if a law or a religious rule from the past made things hard for people, you should change it. Like that's a strong philosophical basis for revolution and reform. And that also seemed to make it pretty appealing to Frances Wright. But another reason she might have been drawn to Epicurus as a historical figure is that his school of philosophy actually included women and slaves as students. So one character in A Few Days in Athens is a semi-historical character known in Epicurean writings as Leontium, but Frances seems to have written her as a little bit of a Mary Sue, or a self-insert character if you are familiar with fan fiction, that she describes Leontium's presence as a kind of looks like her.
It's true. The sort of tall, noble sort of lady who's always just a little bit mysterious, right? She's a little mysterious. Well, reading this book is very much like reading a novel, and reading a novel of the era. You definitely get a strong whiff of romance. There's a lot of very emotional writing, emotional reactions to things. There are these bold characters that speak their minds. But it's also an interesting exploration of intellectual equality between men and women, and sort of the feelings that men and women have to navigate as they attempt to speak to one another on equal terms about major philosophical issues. So it's kind of interesting in that way. It's a pretty quick read, and we will link to it in the show notes. You can check it out on Google Books because it's in the public domain. It definitely is 19th century writing, so take your time. But it's very interesting to see how, you can really get this sort of emotional undercurrent of how important this was to her, in that she got a chance to portray an appropriate, socially acceptable figure who was a brilliant woman telling men they were wrong. Right?
Yeah, and I think
kind of hard to find.
Yeah, and I think everything that Etta was talking about might explain why that was a very important fantasy to write into existence for a woman at that time. Okay, so A Few Days in Athens was very influential, even if it is now no longer famous. No less a reader than American poet Walt Whitman credits it for introducing him to Epicurean philosophy. So I wanted to share Walt's words.
Fanny Wright. We always called her Fanny for affection's sake. Fanny Wright had a nimbus, a halo, is almost sacerdotal. Yes, they may object to her, object as the priestly class would object to Jesus, Socrates. She was one of the few characters to excite in me a wholesale respect and love. She was beautiful in bodily shape and gifts of soul. Her book about Epicurus was daily food to me. I kept it about me for years. It is young, flowery, yet has attributes all its own. Don't you find something of damn certainness in it? She got along beyond that after a time. She was young when she wrote that book, 18, I think. She went beyond Epicurus himself, and he would have commended her for it. Epicurus, all the big fellows, the sages, then, now, always, keep themselves free for new impressions, new lights.
I love how hard Walt Whitman stands fan. I kind of feel like he was a kindred spirit. It's kind of hard not to feel like Walt Whitman's a kindred spirit for all of his quirks. Well, anyway, we'll be talking more about Wright's later career as a public speaker and as a newspaper editor, sort of an extension of her early writings. And it's arguably some of the most important and influential writing she did in her career. So that's coming up in episode 7.
Etta was talking about the courage that it took for women to write and publish in the 19th century. I think that must go double for writing a newspaper. I'm really looking forward to that. But first, coming up next in episode 3, we'll talk about Frances Wright and utopias. Early 19th century America was obsessed with intentional communities that attempted to right the wrongs of mainstream society.
Fanny was involved with Indiana and America's most famous utopian experiment, New Harmony, and founded her own anti-slavery community, Neshoba. And I really can't wait to introduce you to more about those because the stories are pretty wild.
Readings in this episode were by Paul Katanu and Ian Yeager.
Frances Wright, America's Forgotten Radical is a co-production of New Year Media and Her Reputation for Accomplishment, written and hosted by Eleanor Rust and Tristra Yeager.
Made possible by a grant from the Working Men's Institute, New Harmony, Indiana, and by the generosity of the Ephraimson Family Fund. Thanks also to the Bloomington Area Arts Council for supporting this podcast.
Music by Eleanor Dubinsky. Editing and audio support by Josh Perez. See you next time.